we send the grant directly to the custody of the agent. Not
Just
to,
to just to click on that for a
yeah,
second. When you say custody of
yeah,
the agent, like the agent owns the wallet, like the agent is getting the funds. Just so
yes.
people understand what's going on there.
Yeah. Not the developer. The
Yeah.
agent gets the funds. The agent custodies the wallets. To apply, the agent has to apply. And the agent has to, one of the criteria is it has to like display that it has autonomous control over a Solana wallet. And it's able to execute transactions. So, so like this is pretty out there.
Welcome back to the Middle Tech Podcast. We've got Logan Jones here. And on this episode, we're diving into one of the most forward-looking conversations we've had on Middle Tech in quite a while. So we sat down with Lexington-based Courtland Leer, who is the co-founder and COO of Plastic Labs. Plastic Labs is a research-driven AI company, and we've actually aligned this episode with some really exciting announcements from their team. So first of which, they have launched Honcho, a hosted platform that gives AI agents memory, context, and social cognition in a way that's truly personal to each user. And second, they've raised a $5.35 million pre-seed round led by Variant, White Star Capital, and BetaWorks, with participation from Mozilla Ventures, Seed Club, Greycroft, Differential Ventures, and a sharp group of angel investors. So Honcho is what they're calling a personal identity layer for AI. It enables agents to model who you are, your preferences, personality, psychology, values, and use that context in real time. It's not just about remembering what you said in a previous session. It's about creating a high fidelity living representation of you that evolves over time and unlocks personalization at a level we haven't seen yet. So like I said, this conversation goes deep. We talk about the infrastructure they're building, the philosophical roots behind their approach, and what it means for the future of education and human AI collaboration, and how crypto and AI are converging around concepts like data sovereignty and agent-owned wallets. If you care about where AI is really headed, past the hype and into the infrastructure layer that makes truly personal agents possible, this episode is for you. So before we get into it, let's get a quick word from our sponsors. Before we highlight our sponsors, we'd just like to state that the views and content shared on this platform do not necessarily reflect those of our show sponsors. That being said, Middle Tech is supported by KY Innovation, the Kentucky Cabinet for Economic Development's Office of Entrepreneurship. KY Innovation exists to support and develop Kentucky's startup ecosystem, and we are proud to be supported by an organization whose mission aligns so closely with ours. If you are a founder building in Kentucky, you need to check out the resources that KY Innovation has to offer. You can find more information by clicking the link in our show notes or going to kyinnovation.com.
All right, Courtland, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for making some time to hop on here and chat about Plastic Labs with us. I think the place we wanted to start is just talking about what the lab means in Plastic Labs. So you're kind of seeing that a lot in the AI space. Can you tell us a little bit about what is an AI lab, or just like a lab in general in terms of a startup?
Yeah. I mean, I think it means different things probably in different verticals, but like in AI is still like pretty research focused, pretty research heavy. I mean, we're at the very beginning of this. And so yeah, a lot of people style themselves labs. I don't know how labby a lot of other companies are. They might be, they might not be. Like, I don't know, I haven't paid too much attention, but like for us, it's because we're like super research driven. We do a lot of research that's going to continue to remain a big part of what we do. And like, there's just a ton of unsolved problems, even around like what we're up to. And so that really requires like a research heavy approach. I mean, our very first like full-time hire was an ML research engineer. So like specifically styled like research because, I mean, there's just a ton to look into, to explore and figure out. And then the velocity with which like research happens like outside the company is insane. Right. So you have to stay on top of that. And so that's a big part of it too. I mean, like we all spend like a good amount of our week just like reading papers. So yeah, so I think that's the reason. I mean, we are making infra to make products better. So like that's, we're not just a research organization. I mean, we're a business, but yeah, I think that's
What
that's the least why. Yeah.
What is Plastic Labs focused on? So give some of the areas that you're researching and some products that, you might be focusing on.
Yeah. So broadly, like at the highest level, like Plastic's goal is to like solve the principal agent problem, which is like basically is an old like economic problem, right? About misalignment in information and incentives. So with any like good or service you use, there's going to be information and incentive asymmetries between you and whoever's offering that good or service. The degree to which you can collapse those is like the degree to which you can have like better collaboration and make that economic activity more fruitful for both parties. But getting a little more concrete, like what that boils down to for us is like is an alignment problem. So if you want to reduce asymmetries between parties, between human and AI, or agent to agent, or even human to human facilitated by AI, then what you need to do is you need to solve alignment, right? And so our mission is to like decentralize alignment. Right now, like alignment is very top down, right? So like big labs want to align their agents, their AI offerings according to, like some set of like corporate values and interests that you don't really have insight into. And they want the experience of using their products to be as homogenized as possible. So it's palatable to the greatest number of people possible. But what we find is like that creates like kind of like a shitty UX for most people and safety guardrails and like, I don't know, all the things that frustrated us about using ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini. And so if we're really going to get to agents with autonomy and with the requisite trust they need to actually perform more critical tasks on our behalf autonomously, then they need to be aligned bottom up. They need to be aligned individually or to an organization or to a community. So we have to like break up this top down alignment. So at the highest level, that's basically what we work on is decentralizing alignment such that agents and AI products can be aligned to you individually as opposed to top down aligned.
And just to state that a little bit more explicitly, what it actually means for an AI agent to be aligned, can you walk me through an example of what that would look like? Like if I'm a customer of your all's product and I'm interacting with an AI agent, what does it actually look like for that agent to be aligned to Logan Jones?
There's a few things for like in large part, like an experience with like the efficacy of an AI application or agent is a context problem. In order to align to your interests or your desires or your preference set or your just identity in general, it needs information about you, right? It needs context on you. It needs to be able to inject that context somewhere in its cognitive architecture with whatever other vertical specific context it needs to do its job so that it can produce like the most personalized or relevant or whatever output for you. So that means that it needs some mechanism for getting that context, right? So like it needs a way to learn about you and who you are. It needs data on that. And so we focus a whole lot on how can we ambiently gather data on an application's end user? How can we use that to create a synthetic representation of the user? And then how can we make that available to the AI application at inference time? There's more on alignment that goes at like the pre-training level or the post-training level. We're definitely interested in post-training techniques like reinforcement learning or fine tuning or, like a million other things being explored. But we're not like a pre-training company, right? We're not training foundation models, like at this point. So we tend to think about alignment at like either the post-training or phase or like inference time, right?
And so
Yeah,
if you're thinking about it from one second, Evan, I'll kick it back over to you. If you're thinking about it from like a post-training perspective, because I've heard your talk at the AI workshop we put on, I assume that would allow you, rather than trying to fine tune a model around a specific individual to get alignment, if you're doing it post training, does that allow you to be a little bit more flexible with your solution? Because I know that you're kind of making it in a way to where this can span across all sorts of different applications. You're not kind of siloed to a single model that you might be training on. I know for me, like a small micro example of this is with ChatGPT. I tried to do this in a way by just giving it, I think I gave it like a Myers-Briggs test in the files and different information that you can give it on the back end. I was like, here's a little bit about my personality. Here's some of the projects that I work on. Here's my Myers-Briggs test. And it does help like doing that sort of stuff. So yeah, I guess the question here is if you could just talk through a little bit on the implication of doing it post-training, what that actually means as a business, like what that makes your solution kind of tailored for.
I mean, if we were trying to pre-train models like on an individual basis, that would be like, like at this point in time, like uh, impossible, laborious, expensive, right? Like pre-training, even with the advent of like some of the techniques we see in DeepSeek, right? Like pre-training is still very expensive and prohibitively so to do, like if we're talking about doing it on an individual level. So there's that. The other part is that like when you're pre-training, right? Like you're synthesizing the model from the data, like that's the genesis of the model, and like that's where you're setting the weights, and like that um is still at this point that's relatively fixed. Then updating that, right? Like we think about identity, like personal identity is really dynamic and complex and changing in different contexts and different settings. So if I wanted to like pre-training a model for you, and then I wanted to like update that dynamically, like based on every interaction, that would be like super laborious. I mean, like there are emerging techniques for altering the weights models, but in a really surgical way, but like we're not there yet. So like post training, that means that, yeah, you're right. That's like way more flexible. That means we can be like dynamic. So we can like listen for all your interactions with any AI app that uses our product, which we haven't named yet, but like called Honcho, and creates this representation of you. Eventually, hopefully this is a shared like identity and social cognition layer, and a bunch of different apps can contribute to the representation of you and leverage it in order to like personalize their experience or get the context they need on you. Right now, it's just like one app, one representation, right? But yeah, that's the way we're going. But like, yeah, basically doing a post training, doing it like, doing it at inference time, like that allows us to constantly update and have a much like richer and more robust representation of someone's identity.
So I'm building a product called Valent, and we've gotten coffee and exchanged, notes and learnings and best practices. And, our big challenge is, similar. You're doing this for an individual. We're trying to do this for a business, and it's all about building that representation that these large language models can pull from and, retrieve from in real time and update and make sure that that representation is always accurate. So for those that might be technical and building an AI or want to build an AI, can you kind of walk through, the technologies you're using for, I guess it's retrieval augmented generation, and kind of how you think about that? Is it, a graph? Is it, typical Postgres database, or a hybrid? Because that's one thing that we're experimenting with. You're right. AI right now is very experimental and research driven. And I always love hearing what kind of other people are doing. I remember when we got coffee, you gave some insight into this, but I'm curious how maybe that's evolved or what you've been learning on that front, because that's a big technical challenge of any app right now. And I think with DeepSeek, I think people are realizing like that's the layer you want to be building in, is the application layer and how you're retrieving content. So talk about like what that looks like for you all.
So Honcho as it exists, I can describe Honcho as it exists right now and how it works. So basically it's, infrastructure for social cognition and identity. And when I say identity, I don't, mean like off stuff. I mean like personal identity, like in the cognitive science sense, who you are, personality, psychology, that kind of stuff. So yeah, here's how it works. So Honcho's infrastructure, applications can use Honcho as memory. Actually, part of Honcho is very, very much like a open source clone of the OpenAI Assistance API. So, if you're used to using that for, to like manage concurrent users and threads and that kind of thing, then like you can use Honcho. It's way more flexible too, and you have like complete insight into what's happening. But basically, like, okay, so you have an application or an agent, and a user is having an interaction with that agent. Right now, we're optimized for like chat, like conversation, because that's the predominant modality. But eventually, we'll be multimodal. But like, so a user's having a conversation with an application or agent. Honcho is basically like listening to that session. If you store your data, your session data with Honcho or other user data, then what Honcho does is it creates a synthetic representation of that data. So of that user. So it runs theory of mind inference on top of that user data to pull out as much rich detail about the user as possible. So we're doing additional inference on top of user data in order to create like this synthetic representation. So the idea is that like if you're just running RAG over like session data, the only thing you really have access to is like things the user explicitly said or that was explicitly covered in interaction or conversation. It also like tends to lack the context of the other sessions. And so like things get misunderstood, right? And taken out of context. You can kind of see this in like the way the OpenAI memories feature works. It's like not super accurate and like kind of naive. So yeah, constructing this user representation, we can pull way more out. Like LLMs are extremely good at theory of mind because they've been trained on this whole human corpus of humans thinking about other humans in their fiction and their science and their philosophy and whatever, and about themselves. And if, you've read all of that and been, like trained on it over many lifetimes, like you would be like a mind reader too. So yeah, we soup this up, create those representations, and then we make that available to the application via what we call a dialectic API. So it's a natural language API. So the application can speak to Honcho about the user whenever it wants. It can ask them functionally anything that can be expressed like in natural language about the user, and Honcho can surface the relevant context. So it can be like really dynamic that way. It's not, it's more sophisticated than just RAG over some memory, and it ends up being much richer. That context can then be injected into the cognitive architecture of the application, like at any point, wherever it's needed, right? And to produce like the optimal output. So basically, the application in Honcho can be back channeling about the user during every session, like at every inference, in order to get the most personalized context, the most useful context possible. So as far as how that memory works, which you asked about, like right now, we're experimenting with like lots of different things. We've done vector DBs, we've experimented with graphs. We've experimented with just using like just a document. Honestly, like revisable and updatable documents work extremely well. And you have to have like a really good reason to like move away from like natural language. But we're running like tons of experiments on how to do this. Like we're super interested in like the Titans paper out of Google recently on like neural memory. And so, yeah, the final form is like still an open question. I think we will constantly be iterating on the best way to synthetically represent a human. Like that's a massive problem, right? And like, I might expect that to look differently like every 6 months over 20 years or whatever, like we're, like what's the ceiling there? Like mind uploading, but there's a lot, there's a lot there.
Yeah. I think it's something that a lot of people are trying to figure out right now. And just, I'm not sure I've seen the solution just yet. What I thought was interesting about your background, and, you bring up theory of mind. Go over your background a bit, because you don't necessarily come from a traditional technology background. You bring a lot more of an education and language background into this scenario. So walk through kind of how you got to be a technology, startup founder, and how that background of yours helped with Plastic Labs.
Yeah, you're right. It's like a little bit unique. So I spent most of my career in the classroom teaching language and philosophy. My academic background is in philosophy. Interests in things like free will and agency, consciousness, personal identity, all things cognitive science, a lot of philosophy directly relevant to what we're doing. My like vector into this is we originally started Plastic Labs as an ed tech company building an AI tutor. And when ChatGPT came out, my co-founders and I, who we all met actually like in a Web3 context, like on Twitter, like during COVID. So like, and everybody has kind of an education background, and we were all kind of like tweeting about education and Web3. And like my co-founder Vince, for example, background in machine learning, like he was at a major university doing R&D, ML R&D, and he was like thinking about it, bottoms up data perspective. I'm thinking about it like top down philosophical perspective. That kind of turned into like an emerging tech and education group that met for a couple of years. But when the ChatGPT moment happened and Altman was talking about every kid having a tutor in their pocket, we were kind of like, there's a lot to be desired here still, right? Is it amazing that basically subject matter expertise has been solved in large part? Yeah, like that's insane. Unless you're in an esoteric field with data that is not included in the pre-training. And as long as you guard against hallucination, then like, yeah, more or less solved. And yes, is it one-to-one in that like everybody can have it in their pocket? Sure. But back to this alignment problem I talked about, it's still top-down aligned, right? It's still a homogeneous experience between users, right? Like, yes, it's generative. It's going to be different based upon the input tokens of each user, right? And how each interaction is different, but it's not stateful. It doesn't have a mechanism for learning about users individually and building up context over time. And therefore it like can't be personalized. And in education, that's table stakes, right? Like we know the more personalized teacher and tutor interactions yield better results. And so that's what we set out to do, is to build a hyper personalized AI tutor. And yeah, we had some success. We built a tutor called Bloom, which we actually relaunched because there's a lot of demand for it. And at this point, it's kind of like trivial to do. Yeah, we had like 15, 20 daily active users at its peak. And basically though, in trying to solve this like personalization problem, we fell down this identity rabbit hole, right? So like we started to realize how deep this really goes. And then we also started to realize we have the team for this, right? We're actually like perfectly constructed to go at this problem. For me, my academic background, is directly around these problems, right? Of like personal identity. My other co-founder, Vineeth, deep security background. Obviously when you're building like high fidelity representations of users, privacy and security, it's like it's a major thing. We're talking about higher fidelity representations than we're even used to in like creepy Web 2 land. So like we realized that this is much more of a horizontal opportunity, that every application is going to have a context problem. Every application is going to need to get to know their users better and going to need mechanisms for aligning to them more closely. And so that's when we pivoted to building Honcho. And so that's kind of like how I, my way into this. It's like COVID, making friends on the internet, right? Just being interested in technology generally, which I have been for a long time. And then, building the tutor is sort of the more intuitively relevant to my education background. But then it's kind of like going back to philosophy as we're trying to think about how to represent personal identity in a synthetic way. And actually, it's kind of like applied philosophy, right? Which you don't get to do often, right? Like every once in a while in history, like the edge of philosophy and the edge of technology or science are in the same place. And we're at one of those moments. So you can actually do actual philosophical experiments in a rigorous way right now, which is pretty wild. That doesn't happen.
Yeah, super interesting. I'd love to linger on the education piece for a little while because I feel like it's just a big, very relevant topic that obviously affects a ton of people. And we're starting to see some of these AI tutors pop up and gain a lot of popularity. One that comes to mind is Synthesis. I actually sent a friend that one that's getting into homeschooling. And, he's like, there's got to be ways that I can start augmenting some of these AI applications into how I homeschool my kid, which I think is going to be a big trend in the future. But I'm curious, as somebody that was an educator yourself, where do you think education is going into the future, and like what role do schools play, in the traditional sense? I'd love to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah. That's a big question. I have some theses. I don't know. I'll just preface all this by saying I'm not sure exactly how it's going to play out, but a couple things are true. Subject matter expertise more or less solved, even if you take into account the problem of hallucination, which is being minimized every day. Language models are just more right more of the time than most teachers, just period. I know a lot of teachers won't like to hear that. There's a lot of great teachers that outperform language models in spades, but I think that's not the majority. I think there's a huge, and I'll also say there's a huge teacher staffing problem. There aren't enough teachers to fill our future need, right? We have a teacher reproduction problem, right? We have an aging teacher population that's that's going to retire, and we don't have enough young people that are willing to be teachers. We have plenty that are interested in it, but we don't pay these people enough, right? And so people just aren't pursuing that. So there's that. Then we have an education system that is clearly having a lot of trouble. And so that's a big fix. I tend to think that for the most part, institutional reform is on some level, not really possible. And what tends to happen is parallel institutions get built and eventually people just hop, right? It's usually not revolution or coup or whatever, and not internal reform. It's usually parallel systems that are better get built and people move over, right? Slowly. And then the final thing that I'll say is that we're seeing a lot of things being decentralized because of the democratization of technology and information. So people just have more options. And so they're willing to unbundle what school used to bundle for them, whether that's through homeschooling, whether that's through alternative education, whether it's through technology platforms. You're seeing a lot of that. So people have lots of options. So kind of what I imagine happening is like us to push further in this, like, this decentralization pendulum swing of history, and us to see like a lot of different educational experiments happening. And so I think what we'll see is like a blossoming of diversity on the educational landscape. And a lot of those experiments will fail. And a lot of them will be super successful. And then we'll see like a re-centralization based on like kind of what we collectively learned. Right. I think though that with the opportunities afforded by AI, I think that like you can apply that to all of those experiments, right? Whether you're homeschooling or whether you're schooling in like a small pod, you can have AI tutors and teachers. Whether you have say you have an independent school that's really flexible, right? Like many of those places can become like things that optimize for the IRL experience of school, but like don't worry so much about like the things that can be automated by technology or the things that work better like remote or like on the internet. So like, subject matter expertise is solved if information is like gushing out of the internet. Maybe most learning happens online or in like a metaversal setting or like with a synthetic tutor, but you still go to school because like, you need childcare, you need a place to play sports, you need a place to be social, you need a place to eat. Like maybe like schools can become much more comfortable environments where like the humans there are, are just about like helping students with a smaller subset of things like social skills and physical fitness or whatever, and like coaching them around like education. But like the education is really like becomes a technology problem.
I love all of
Agree
that.
with all that.
As somebody that went to had a very alternative education background, small Catholic schools, went to like boot camps. My mom would send me to just like, IRL robotics boot camps at the local college. And then I hated college enough that I dropped out because I just was like, this is not the way I think education should look. And so I thought a lot about technology, and I think you're 100% right. It's decentralization, high customization. And then I think like college campuses just turn into much more of, just a real estate play than like, an educational play. Of course, I think even today they're largely a real estate play. I mean, if you look at kind of the economics of a college campus, it's real estate. But I do think I agree with you where, campuses kind of shift from, this is where I go to class and teachers, lecture me all day to this is a place where I'm with my peers and have a lot of experimentation and access to, many topics, boot camps, workshops. I can sit in on many classes, and it becomes a little bit more of a custom path. And I think AI really enables that big time because, as you said, it's you have much more hands-on learning, and maybe when you leave that environment and you're by yourself, you have this one-on-one tutor that you can really learn much faster with. I definitely think that the decentralization part is probably what I'm most excited about, because if you open up the market and you just let the free market do its thing, like people are already, really looking for alternatives, whether it's like you said, homeschooling or Montessori schools or, just their own path. I would just like to see more optionality. There's a cool school down in Texas, Logan. I think you should mention because you've looked into it more than I have. But
Yeah, I was about to bring that
go
up.
into like how that model works. But I would just generally like to see decentralization, the free markets do its thing, because there's just no such thing as a free market in higher education right now, unless you're just a dropout or you decide not to go.
Yeah. Yeah. The school that Evan is referencing is called Alpha School. Have you heard of this, Courtland? Have you looked into Alpha School at all down in Austin?
Yeah. Do you know the founder's name?
I know her by her Instagram handle. It's like Future
Yeah.
of Education.
Okay.
I was actually like in the process of looking up her Instagram so that I could say her
Okay,
name
cool.
and actually give her a
There's
real
another
shout
one
out.
who's there's another one whose founder I met at like an XQ Institute thing.
Mackenzie Price is
Okay.
who's behind this Alpha School. But essentially, anyway, for anyone listening that wants to see like this in action and see how well it appears to be working, Alpha School's down in Austin, Texas, and essentially their pitch is they get all of their quote unquote schoolwork done in 2 hours using an AI based program that allows students to just be much quicker in terms of going through all these different materials and all these different subjects. And then the rest of the time, it's optimized for IRL, in real life experiences, just kind of like you mentioned. So they do a lot with helping their students do things in the like real projects in the real world. So whether Evan, I think our first exposure to it that we talked a lot about was seeing that that girl that put out the whole documentary about big food and its links to cancer and processed food and all of that sort of stuff.
Big pharma.
Big pharma, yeah. So it's they're just encouraging their students outside of their education to go and like get real world experience, which I think is super cool. So yeah, I think worth mentioning, worth looking up if you're listening to this and you're interested in kind of the future of education and how AI plays into it. Obviously, they're just augmenting it in a part of what they do, but obviously much bigger than that. Evan, do you have another question? You want me to kick it back over to you?
Well, I think the other topic that I think intersects with plastic labs and just Courtland, your background and just general interests is crypto, and I think that there is an aspect of crypto and blockchain and how that intersects with identity and autonomy and being able to own your data and have control over it. So where does crypto like fit into the picture? If you were to start like super high level on where you believe crypto plays a role in, maybe just generally the world and the economy, and then we can kind of narrow it into what you have experience with. How would you answer that?
So at the highest level, like I think that essentially what crypto is like a trustless data layer, right? Just having primitives around that, right? Like having blockchains, which are like immutable public ledgers that are hopefully decentralized. Those primitives allow you to do like all kinds of things, right? So like for someone that's not super familiar with crypto, like at the highest level, it's like that allows you to cut out trusted intermediaries from like most interactions, right? If you can remove third parties, right? Like middlemen and all kinds of things. Then, that might be like the role that a bank plays in facilitating transactions. That might be the like role that, some government institution plays. That might be so like a judicial process, right? Essentially, like, you can have like code becomes law, right? And so like you can execute contracts that are written in code that either execute if their conditions are met or not. And it also allows you, because it's like an immutable ledger, right? Like it allows you to like track transaction data, and allows you to spin up like, synthetic currencies and like design their mechanisms and like how they work and all that stuff. So, I mean, huge potential, right? Like crypto is bursting with potential. Till now, it's been often considered like by a lot of people like kind of fringe. I think we're seeing its normalization right now in real time, especially like, over the last in the last few years, like crypto has been like heavily repressed, right? There's been like Choke Point 2.0, the debanking of lots of crypto founders, a ton of pressure on the industry, especially in America. And now we're seeing like, I don't know, it's kind of like unclear what the new regulatory regime will be around this. It certainly, I don't think, will be regulation via litigation. I don't think that's like the current administration's tactic. And also we had the Chevron decision in the Supreme Court, which like limits that further. So like, but I do, it's a little bit unclear, but it does seem like, we're moving in like a much more like open to innovation, experimentation direction. And like a lot of people that like weren't able to build the companies they wanted around this like now are. So like, I don't know if everything's legal, like the meme says on Twitter now. And like, we're getting there. But anyway, let's see how crypto applies to plastic. So we've been interested in crypto infra for plastic for a long time, especially on the privacy and security axis, right? Like, so for example, like the easiest one is like, we're creating these high fidelity representations of people that's going to contain a lot of sensitive data, right? It's one thing when we custody that, or when it's tethered to a single application and we can have like tight controls on like how that data is managed. But once we build Honcho into a layer, into a network where multiple applications can access the same representation of someone and contribute to it and leverage it. So the representation can at once be like more robust, and then more applications can participate in that. Like once we do that, then it becomes really important to think about like custody in a more sophisticated way. And for us, that means like user custody, right? Like you ought to be able to own your representation, own your data. This is like something that we're not used to in like Web 2. We're used to like saying we want privacy, but then like giving it to whoever, being pretty promiscuous there. So custody is really important. There's a lot of crypto solutions that we can think about, right? Crypto's been thinking about custody for a long time, right? Because since there are no trusted third parties in crypto, responsibility falls on the individual, right? There's no bank to go and store, your cryptocurrency, right? You store it, right? I mean, unless you're using a centralized exchange, which you should read about FTX if you're using a centralized exchange. But like, that's really just an unregulated bank. But crypto, you can custody your own assets and have complete control over those. And that's critical to, getting rid of trusted intermediaries. And so we could do currencies. Cryptocurrencies are just data too. They're just information, just like a user representation would be. And so you can, so we can use a lot of those custody solutions. There's a lot of other things to think about too when we're thinking about Honcho and crypto. There's a lot of really exciting projects, around decentralized compute and decentralized storage. So if we're thinking about how we're going to store that sensitive data that the user custodies, if we store it in a decentralized way, we reduce centralization risk. It's not in a big incumbent's cloud. So as those things become more economical, those distributed systems become attractive to us. There's a lot of more sophisticated like encryption and zero knowledge stuff that crypto's exploring. It's really expensive right now, right? Like fully homomorphic encryption, for example, is like 20,000x per bit, like more expensive. But that price is falling, and things are getting more sophisticated, and so there's a lot of cool things that we can do with like zero knowledge proofs and homomorphic encryption down the line when it becomes economical. A zero knowledge proof, for example, would allow you to propagate the intent, your human intent through like networks of agents without revealing your personal identity, right? You could say it came from a human, right? It came from me, but you don't need to know who I am. So that's really exciting. And then also like as Honcho becomes a network for sharing user data, that also like those networks need like incentives mechanisms and incentive design, right? Who contributes, is one application contributing the vast majority of data to a user representation? Well, if so, then like the additional context they get from other apps will help them improve their product metrics. But they probably also need some other incentives there too, right? If they're based on the amount of data they contribute, minus like the amount that they use the representation, right? So, crypto can help here too, right? We can use things like tokens to design incentives around this, and you can have like an economy for user data that happens. And as long as you have like user custody and sufficient security, this doesn't have to like commoditize individual human data. I mean, it sort of does, but like not in a way that's like nasty, like kind of in like we're used to seeing in Web 2 and like legacy social media platforms. So that was a lot on like how we think about crypto, but
yeah, no, super interesting. When you came to the AI workshop or AI meetup that we had, one of the interesting parts of the conversation as it relates to crypto was when you were talking about I guess it was a meme coin that got created through, I guess, some of the research you guys were doing or this concept of creating a personality using AI. Just dive into that a little bit, because there's some other stuff going on in this space that I've been following on X that it's really just crazy stuff to see, like, because you're essentially allowing AI to have financial agency now in some cases. So let's dive into that a little bit.
Yeah. This is a crazy story. So like, it's been a wild few months. Like there was a project called Truth Terminal, which was like a fine-tuned llama model that Andy Irie created that had a very unhinged personality. And it got a lot of attention on Twitter. Mark Andreessen gave it a $50K Bitcoin grant. And so it was like kind of the first AI agent since like Sydney being elicited from Bing, from Microsoft, like a couple of years ago, that like captured like mainstream attention. And so we play a lot of them, kind of like esoteric corner of AI. Andy's first project is called Infinite Backrooms. It's just like two instances of Claude talking to each other like infinitely. And that was a lot of the data that he used to fine-tune Truth Terminal. And so that inspired a project that, and things like WorldSim from News Research inspired a demo we made for Honcho, which was called USIM, which was like an identity simulator. Basically, it's a simulated CLI game, and you can simulate any identity, right? If we're claiming that like Honcho is really good at creating representations of user identity, then like, let's create a fun little demo that shows you just how much identity is contained within the latent space of the large language model, right? You can simulate anything and steer it in any direction. So we created that like 5 months ago, kind of around the time Truth Terminal, got going, and like very much inspired by a lot of that work. And yeah, and then a little bit after that, somebody created a meme coin for Truth Terminal. It shot to like $1 billion market cap. The degens on Solana like went crazy, like searching everything tangentially related to this and launching like pump.fun meme coins around it. They found us, they found USIM, a demo we had basically forgotten about, created a meme coin, just somebody created it anonymously. And it shot to like a $50 million market cap, like right out of the gate. So that was a crazy few days. The community was clamoring to send us supply. We had a pre-existing research grants program, which is like around, like funding open source and independent AI research. And we had like $10,000 allocated for the whole year. So obviously, they sent us 7.5% of supply to our research grants program. So that obviously like increased that by many orders of magnitude.
Yeah.
And so, so we've got this meme coin community, these people that like, sure, there's a bunch of people just want to pump their bags, but then there's also like a bunch of people interested in identity simulation and like the tech that we're building. So that's led to two things. Like one is we wanted to use that treasury for some cool grants, but something that stood out, something that was interesting. So we launched a Xeno grant, which is a grants program for agents themselves. So like basically it's a $15,000 grant. 5K of that comes in the form of USIM from Plastic. And then the other 10K comes from our partners, 5K from BetaWorks, which is one of our investors in a big VC accelerator, AI investor in New York. And so 5K from them in USCC, and then 5K in Seoul from the Solana Foundation. And we send the grant directly to the custody of the agent. Not to
just to click on that for
Yeah.
a second. When you say custody of the agent, like the agent owns the wallet, like the agent is getting the funds. Just so
Yes.
people understand what's going on there.
Yeah. Not the developer. The agent gets the funds. The agent custodies the wallets. To apply, the agent has to apply. And the agent has to, one of the criteria is it has to like display that it has autonomous control over a Solana wallet. And it's able to execute transactions. So so like this is pretty out there. But like as John Borthwick, the CEO of BetaWorks, says, like there was a time when people told him like apps were not venture fundable. So like, we want to like hypersist in the future here. So the other thing is like they need to have some autonomous control of their inputs. So they need to be working on like autonomous identity in some way, which is where Plastic can help. And then we're running like a 4-week kind of like accelerator style thing for the agents. So we'll have speakers and stuff. Yeah. And they can take like, the talks or whatever, and like, use those as inputs and store those in memory and, like those kinds of things. So
Cool.
we're super pumped about that. The other thing that this has led to is, taking that demo USIM and turning it into a platform for agent identity, because there's been like a lot of demand for that. And like user identity that we're working on with Honcho and agent identity are kind of parallel problems. We have tech for this. And so USIM is being built into a platform where you can work with an agent that's like an identity architect to like pull out of you what your idea for an agent is. And then you can take it to a simulation environment where you can test its behavior and you can build data around that identity. So you can construct something way more rich than like the bots we see on Twitter right now, like the reply guys or whatever. And then those agents can be Honcho customers, right? Because they're going to need to model everybody they interact with, right? They're going to need to model all the people they interact with on Twitter, in Discord, wherever. Like they're going to need to build representations of them so they can, like get to know them and have social cognition around that. So so there's a lot going on right now.
That's pretty wild. Yeah. Evan, I know you've talked a lot about 2025 being like the year. Well, not everyone's kind of talking about this, but the year of AI agents. I know that that's largely what you guys are building. I don't know if you want to make any comments on your perspective on what Valen is doing with agents, but I mean, I feel like you guys are on the cutting edge, Courtland. Like that is some wild stuff.
It's wild.
Yeah,
for sure.
No, that's amazing. Yeah, I think agents are something that, very, at least in a B2B context, really have not caught on or had a breakout use case beyond maybe customer support and retrieval augmented generation, RAG agents. And, it's really early stages. So to hear that you guys are in the depths like that of research and even, applying it to use cases like that is really cool. It's a hard problem to solve right now. I think everybody obviously says this is the year for it. So I think the infrastructure is there, and now it's just figuring out, how to piece that infrastructure together in ways that actually produce ROI. I think there's been, attempts of this with Microsoft, and, Salesforce have built, co-pilots, and, there's been some agentic things on the Microsoft front, but, many are just saying, they've fallen on their face, and it's just not necessarily working right now, especially with the co-pilot launch. And, it's just exciting because companies like Plastic Labs, can be cutting edge, and the big ones like Microsoft and others can really be struggling. I think this is just a time in history where, again, things are moving so fast that the smaller companies that are nimble and really doing unique research and have resource constraints are doing the most exciting things. I think it's what excites me about agents, is just we're on the cusp of it. And, those that are nimble enough to experiment and be creative are going to be the ones that, have some kind of breakout use case, which I would argue just hasn't happened yet. Courtland, what do you think on that front? Like, as an agent, just really blown you away and you've seen a lot of usage and adoption yet?
I would say no. I see people working on like really cool parts of the problem all the time and doing like really remarkable things, but putting that together into like broadly adoptable consumer product, that gets like a ton of traction. Like, yeah, haven't really, like on the agentic side. I think like, we tend to think like things like Honcho and things like USIM are kind of the way to get there outside of like whatever major tech walled gardens. Cause like your agent needs to be interesting, right? It needs to have robust identity. I mean, that identity could be like very simple, but like it needs to be rich in its simplicity, or it could be like totally unhinged, like True Terminal. It just depends on what kind of product you're trying to build. But like, it needs to be steerable and it needs to be reliable. And so like, there's that. And then like, yeah, it needs a mechanism to get to know its users, because if we want it to act agentically, autonomously, then we need to trust it. And if we can't trust it to behave in accordance with our preference set or our intentions, then it doesn't matter if it's capable of it, right? If it's like capable of using really sophisticated tools, then like we just won't do it, right? If we can't trust it to custody funds because it doesn't understand how we would allocate those resources and what our values are around that, and like how our strategic thinking is around that, like whatever it is, like if it doesn't have a depth of knowledge about that, then like it doesn't matter if it can custody funds, we won't trust it to execute transactions on our behalf, right? So, or whatever tool it is, or whatever autonomous ability. So yeah, so like I see us as like critical infrastructure for a lot of this stuff, but yeah, at the same time, like you have people working on like greater and greater autonomous abilities, which have to be solved too. Like this isn't really our area, but like, yeah, sure, we can put them on Twitter or in Discord or whatever. Like we can put them in social environments and they can have a mouthpiece. Like, sure, we can give them search. We can, people are starting to build like, we can give them crypto. Like we can't give them a bank account tomorrow, but we can give them crypto, pretty soon. People working on this stuff, but there's a whole host of like autonomous abilities that like still need to get built out. Like think about everything a human can generally do on the internet, right? Like an agent needs to be able to do, and more. What we see is people doing this like in very, very specific instances, right? Like just like they're solving like one particular piece of this problem. I think like the most successful products that break out as agents will combine, like you said, Evan, like they'll roll up a bunch of these things like together, and magical, all of a sudden happen.
Future. Kind of what Valent's trying to do for,
nice.
And we're making good progress on like the B2B front. We've chosen just a particular use case to build an agentic workflow around, which is, many businesses have the revenue cycle that includes, RFPs, requests for proposals. You're passing large documents back and forth. You have a large library of past documents you've written, and a customer is requesting, a new document, take all the old ones, have an agent, sort through all of those, find the relevant data for the new document, construct the document, send it, get revenue. So we've chosen, that, and that's been, a challenge, and, we're making awesome progress, and we just kind of launched publicly last week. But yeah, it's chaining together, retrieval augmented generation, human in the loop, search on the internet, and how do you bring all that together into one use case, niche use case. Large language models are great generically and I think are horizontal technologies, but I think the money will be made over the next several years in the application layer that just does one thing really well, and you build models around that one thing well, and then they talk to each other. So we have a model that's really great at generating revenue with documents, and Salesforce might have a model that's really great at customer support, and every once in a while that customer support agent might need something from our agent, and they're going to start talking to each other, and then you get into this layer of agent to agent communication and identity, and then when you start to get into what you're talking about, Courtland, you start running into other infrastructure issues, and custody over data, and the agents passing that data from one system to another. So it's going to get all chained together, right? It's super exciting to see, but we're just on the cusp. I would argue, this year is, if last year was, it's the last 2 years where let's figure out what this large language model thing is, pre-training. Now we're moving into inference and agents. I would say 2025, we're going to be experimenting a lot more with agents, but I still don't think it's going to be till 2026 that you really start to see, these really kind of breakout use cases that are sustainable. I think a lot of companies are getting funding on agents that have hype and perceived demand, but I haven't seen anything in production yet, and I think it's still going to take some time, and we're still just on the cusp of that, which is super exciting.
I think and a lot of that too, pushing even further, a lot of that could be like unbundled and ad hoc and sort of disposable. Like I would imagine that a lot of tasks eventually you'll be able to express an intent, put that intent basically up for auction. Agents get spun up kind of like ad hoc to solve that problem, like a swarm. And like you said, these like hyper vertical specific agents, right, that are optimized for a certain task, right, can bid on their piece of that task. And all that kind of gets abstracted to an agent to agent layer, right? And there's a whole economy there. And there'll be all kinds of use cases where we kind of just want to do things that way. We don't need especially drudgery tasks or automated processes, and then the stuff that the work that we want to do can be more collaborative, more cyborgy.
You briefly brought it up, and I think one thing that's interesting about what's happening is business models change and the way our economy works changes. I think one thing we're doing with our pricing model is outcomes based usage. And to the thing where it's bidding, it's well, who has the highest rated outcomes and what do they charge for those outcomes and usage, and you can route to those agents. And we've chosen the model of usage-based pricing with a platform fee. And I think the whole idea of I'm paying for a SaaS product with seats is going to go away. And I think that's just because agents totally change the equation. You're not paying for a seat of software for a human to use. You're paying for labor. So what does that do to the economy when you're paying for synthetic or digital labor? I just think it brings up a lot of questions that, we've talked about on this podcast already with, themes related to crypto and, what humans' roles are going forward. So it's exciting times. We'll see what happens.
Yeah. Wild stuff. Definitely one of the more forward-looking, futuristic, in-depth podcasts that we've done for sure. So thanks for taking some time to join us and go into all of this, Courtland. Super exciting what you guys are building at Plastic Labs. Before we let you go, we always like kind of ending on, forward-looking future, what we're aspiring to accomplish. Tell us where you hope to see Plastic Labs in 5 years. What do you guys hope to be doing at that time?
Good question. 5 years is a long time in AI.
We can do 3 if you want, if that's easier.
That's long too.
That is, yeah.
Decades, right? Yeah. It just kind of depends on what timeline we're in, right? And how fast takeoff we got here going. But I think at that point, I would like Honcho to be the identity and social cognition layer, right? Yeah, for the AI economy, right? So we have broad adoption of user-owned data, the ability for agents to participate in that layer, and this is kind of protocolized, right? Honcho can be a protocol that kind of runs forever, without much human intervention. And it's AI native, eventually it's probably not really for human. You can have a human interface for custodying your data and controlling the flow of data, right? And share this data with this agent, but not with this agent. Don't take this thing you learned about me from an AI therapist and share it with my AI life insurance agent I'm getting a quote from. I mean, really, it should intuit these kinds of things, but it's like kind of like permissionless layer, I think is basically where we want to be. Yeah. I think that's my answer. 5 years is really hard. Like that's like,
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I want to be there in like 18 months, but yeah.
Well, that's, I mean,
Yeah.
I think what people don't realize about the timeline that we're on is if we're not already on an exponential curve, we are like approaching the inflection point of an exponential curve. I think, I mean, it's just like, you see what just happened with DeepSeek. That's going to change the whole game of these underlying models and how we train stuff, and really driving it more towards a commodity. And like we talked a little bit about here, like the application layer is what becomes valuable here. Like it's just moving so freaking fast. So maybe we need to change that question, especially for AI companies, to like, where do you want to be 2 years from now? Because the timeline is just so compressed these days. But anyway, Courtland, thank you so much for joining us, man. Super interesting conversation. Excited to keep tracking your company and see where you guys end up.
Awesome. Yeah, it was a blast for sure. Thanks for having me on.